Shalom, shalom. You'll notice that there's no desk here. I'm not sitting as though the focus is to teach you a lesson. Nor am I standing at a pulpit as though I'd be preaching to you to tell you something that you should do. But rather, my heart is to share with you things that I've heard, that I've seen, that I've been through, that have come from the Lord, that have become really foundation stones in my life and of my family, our household, over the last 50 years. So I hope you'll be able to receive this as a conversation. And just consider these thoughts and let them settle with you. And hopefully they'll be worth your while to listen to, and they will bear fruit in your lives as they have in mine. In thinking about our spiritual life, I think it's pretty simple that the most important thing is to know God. And not just to know Him from a distance, but to know His heart and to know His nature, which to some degree is evident from the creation, but perhaps only to some degree. There are two men in history that stand out in a remarkably unique position. They're Enoch and Elijah. With all of the billions upon billions of people that have lived, only two, did not die a natural death. You know, I sometimes wonder, how is it that we're not speaking about this more, because it's so amazing, dramatic, incredible. There's not much said about Enoch. We see in Genesis chapter 5, it says that Enoch's years were 365, and that he walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. That's it. That's all that's written here in the Tanakh, really about Enoch. So let's skip ahead. We'll come back to Enoch and consider Elijah. There's a lot more written about Elijah. He's someone that has quite a relationship with God and quite a ministry. Perhaps he's the undisputed prophet of power, as he slew hundreds of false prophets, did miracles, spoke things into existence, called fire down out of heaven. And he didn't die a natural death. But let's look at a passage in 1 Kings chapter 19 that's pretty familiar. So the Lord spoke to Elijah, and he said, "Go out and stand on the mountain before the Lord." And behold, the Lord passed by, and a great and strong wind tore into the mountains and broke the rocks in pieces before the Lord. But the Lord was not in the wind. And after the wind, an earthquake, but the Lord was not in the earthquake. And after the earthquake, a fire. But the Lord was not in the fire. And after the fire, a still small voice. And so it was, when Elijah heard it, that he wrapped his face in his mantle and went out and stood in the entrance of the cave. And suddenly a voice came to him and said, "What are you doing here, Elijah?" What first happened in these three dimensions of wind, earthquake, and fire is so much according to the nature of this particular person, of this prophet. He moved in that dimension. That's who he was. You know, isn't it true that when we think of God, we think of power, of magnificence, of greatness, of glory, of things that we can't even think about, that we can't conceive. But something here is of a different nature. And we're considering this in the context of it being a revelation given to one of the two people in all of history that did not die a natural death. And I wonder that something happened here. Because, we asked the question, so what was it about Enoch? What was it about Elijah that set them apart? So what's written about Enoch is he walked with God. Well, if we take that in the fullness of those simple words, it means he knew God. He saw God face to face. He understood God. He was hand in hand with God. He was so united. He was so one with God. So, would logic not tell us that somehow Elijah, in his experience of God, would have to be likewise, that he also would have had this kind of intimate knowledge of God that set him apart in such a special way. And I believe that this is what we see here, that Elijah's general experience and general life orientation was like most of us: power, anointing, glory, magnificence. And he finds out that God is not inhabiting those things. Or shall we say, those are the things reflective of what God does, but it didn't reflect who he was deep inside. Now, when we read this in the Hebrew, which it's an important thing as we're studying in the Tanakh, and we get to key passages that are critical, that are sort of make or breaks, changing directions, really need to look at the Hebrew. And in this particular case, the words for still and small are actually more than it would appear in the English or the other language translations. The word for still is dmama. It's a word that means, literally, it means dumb, unable to speak. So, what a curious phrase that is. That the voice is a dumb voice. Can you hear a sound of a dumb voice? You wouldn't describe such a thing to God. And the word for small is daka. And it's not just small in size, but in its root it means crushed, as in flattened. Now think about that. This is the description of the voice that Elijah heard, in which dwelt the presence of God. This was a bit of a switch for Elijah's perception of God. It defies really describing what a dumb voice is or what a crushed voice is. But I feel like I heard it once. Some years back, 20-some years ago, the movement began of raising up prayer houses, worship houses, cities all over the world. And people were crying out for God to come to their city. And they were praying 24/7 and worshiping and crying out. And this is what I heard. Everyone wants me to come to their city. But what about my city? What about Jerusalem? And really, Israel? And the sound of that voice that spoke those words, I can only say it reminded me, made me think of a child who had been abandoned, who didn't feel cared about. It wasn't loud, it wasn't boisterous, it wasn't angry, it was hurt. What about my city? What about me? We talked in a former speaking about how God felt neglected, because most of his people came to him only when they wanted something. And this picture is a continuation of that thought and that spirit. How important is it for us to see God as he really is, to know him? And we have something here in looking at these two men and putting their stories together that give us perhaps a very different picture of God than what we're used to looking at. And consequently, it has great potential to change the way we feel about everything that's going on.